people have a right to vote.
Over the years, Rose Trammell has gotten pretty good at putting flag sticks together. It's one of the tasks people with intellectual disabilities can do here at Fulton County's North Training Center. While there are many things that Rose can do with confidence, there are other things she'll never be able to do, but voting isn't one of them. Mary Woods has worked for the county's mental health division since 1973 and says although Rose and others like her may have certain limitations, people with intellectual disabilities deserve to be treated like anyone else.
They look different, they talk different, and they may even act different. So we as humans, it's a human thing, we as humans tend to shun something that's different from what we are because that's not what we're accustomed to.
But should people who have cognitive or intellectual disabilities vote? Laughlin McDonald, director of the Voting Rights Project for the American Civil Liberties Union, says yes.
If we're concerned, we need to educate them to the fullest extent that they're capable of being educated, and that includes, I think, assisting them in making these political decisions that the rest of us make, because they're affected by them too.
When the framers of the Constitution were laying the groundwork for the liberties that most Americans enjoy today, their treatise was understood at the time to include only white men. And though some of the signers may have been uncomfortable with that scenario, the document set forth reflected American society as it was in the latter part of the 18th century.
One of the great conceits that we have in this country is that the right to vote has always been something that's been fundamental and universally recognized. That is far from the reality. The only people who could vote as a practical matter were white male property owners who were over the age of 21. Women didn't get the right to vote until passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. American Indians didn't get the right to vote as a formal matter of federal law until passage of the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. We had literacy tests that were expressly upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States for much of our history. We had the all-white primary, which was expressly upheld by the Supreme Court for a long period in our history. But our whole history, insofar as the right to vote is concerned, is one of constantly trying to expand the franchise to get beyond this very limited concept of a white elite, male elite, being the only ones who could be trusted with the ballot. So our history has really been quite different from what we like to think it's been.
Directly following the American Civil War, the addition of 3 amendments to the U.S. Constitution would dramatically change the political landscape in this country. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th guaranteed citizenship to anyone born in the United States and denied individual states the power to take away any privileges associated with that status. The 15th Amendment held that you could not deny someone the right to vote because of their race. But it did not create that right per se.
The right to vote is something that's created by state law. There's nothing in the federal Constitution that independently guarantees the right to vote. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment provide that when the right to vote is given, that it has to be given on a basis of equality without any distinctions based on race or color or previous condition of servitude.
The U.S. Constitution held that the states would work out the details of how their electors were chosen, and though the 14th Amendment was crafted in large part to protect the voting rights of freed slaves, individual states would eventually find ways around federal protection. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation kept African Americans from any real power in the South for several decades after Reconstruction. A hard-fought prize was eventually captured by way of the Voting Rights Act, passed by Congress in 1965. The measure cast away many artificial voting barriers and laid a foundation for voting rights to be upheld for the sake of other disenfranchised groups later on.
We had the big breakthrough in the 1960s with the one-person, one-vote decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Shortly before the highly touted Civil Rights Act of 1964 and subsequent Voting Rights Act were passed, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment could not be effective unless each voting district within a state was made up of roughly the same number of people. Up until that time, districts were apportioned according to land size and as a means to keep the status quo. When districts begin to be divided up according to population rather than area, a major shift away from the traditional rural power base to the more densely populated urban areas was begun. The court actions that led to this outcome became known as the one-person, one-vote ruling.
If you don't have the right to participate in the process of making the laws, then you become not simply someone who is denied the benefit of the laws, you become the victims of the laws. And blacks were denied the right to vote. They had no say, and as a consequence, we had racial segregation in every aspect of life in the South. The Supreme Court said the right to vote is fundamental. Everybody should have the right to an equal say. And we got the one-person, one-vote cases implemented, which has really transformed politics in the South and in the United States at every level.
This and the earlier Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education helped tear down the obstacles that excluded minorities from fully participating in society. The power of those edicts reverberates today with laws designed to make public places more accessible to everyone. And what do you think about voting?
I like to vote.
Thursa Frazier has cerebral palsy. Many state constitutions once prohibited people like Thursa from voting because communication impairment was often thought to be a symptom of mental incompetence.
People with disabilities in our society are devalued persons.
Many states have had wording in their constitutions that stereotype those with intellectual or cognitive disabilities, blocking their ability to fully participate in the political process. And it hasn't been so long since those with physical limitations were, for all intents and purposes, locked out as well.
I want them to respect my opinion.
You want them to respect your opinion?
Yeah.
There are issues of respect and issues of, the fact that people who need help are a problem. And in my opinion, that's a problem.
If you look back in history, there are hundreds of people who are major historical characters, presidents, scientists, all kinds of folks who had various disabilities.
Everyone has value. Everyone has something to give. Everyone brings a gift to society. And the thing is, many of us who think we're okay will become a disabled citizen if we live long enough. And the more inclusive we are, the more respectful we are, and the more we learn about the persons who we think are, not as gifted as we, the better we'll be as a society, in my opinion.
The state of Georgia does not routinely prohibit people with intellectual or cognitive disabilities from voting. There are some cases, however, when a person can be declared mentally incompetent, but it takes a very special circumstance to meet those criteria.
Even the very statutes that allow for guardians to be appointed recognize that a competing and equally important goal is to get people, more able to make decisions for themselves. And I think that's true about people. I don't think you help them by taking away the decisions in their life. It seems to me you help them by allowing them to make those decisions and to do everything that we can as a society to assist them in making informed decisions. But I don't think you help them by turning their backs on the processes of citizenship, including voting.
I think it's right for everybody to vote.
When you think of 59 million Americans who have a mental or physical disability, you're talking about, close to 25% of the population. That's significant voting power.
Some might argue that a voting bloc comprised in some measure of people who have intellectual disabilities is more vulnerable to manipulation and voter fraud.
There's a potential for manipulation, and one ought to be concerned about it. And for that reason, it is a crime to, interfere with the right to vote. And I think that if those criminal laws are enforced in situations where there really is evidence of intimidation and manipulation is a way to go about that. I don't think that depriving people of the right to vote is the way to deal with that problem.
I had to have somebody help me, because I didn't know how to do the new voting machine. So.
But you knew what man you were voting for.
Yeah.
The Voting Rights Act was amended in 1982 to expressly provide that people who need assistance can have assistance in voting, but it limits the people who can assist them by excluding people who are members of a labor union that voter may belong to, or some employer or agent of the employer. So this provision understands that there is this possibility of people going in and voting, actually voting for the person. But the person has a right to take somebody that person trusts into the voting booth.
In recent years, laws seeking to protect the rights of people with physical and mental limitations have found their way into public policy with measures like the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act, the National Voter Registration Act, or Motor Voter Bill as it's called, and the most far-reaching legislation to date, Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, passed by Congress in 1990.
And the intent is to provide equal access to community life, if you will, for all persons who have either mental or physical or both types of impairments. And whether that's voting, whether that's coming to talk to someone about your taxes, your property taxes, whether that's going to a grocery store, a movie, restaurant, any place that you or I would go and be able to access services, goods, programs, and so forth. The law is intended for people with disabilities to be able to access and participate equally in those same programs.
People like Rose Trammell may not articulate their opinions as well as some, but does that make their opinions less valid?
Well, who's going to be the judge of that? Who's going to be able to say you are mentally capable of making those judgments, understanding those issues and decisions, and making a logical? Who is that person, or who is that group of people?
Well, some of the soldiers come back home.
Mm-hmm. Does that worry you that we have young men and women over there fighting?
Yeah, and some of them gets killed.
How does one determine who gets to vote and who doesn't?
Well, in this state, there has to be a judicial determination. And that's an important step in the right direction, because once you go into court, then you're entitled to things like counsel and due process and all the protections, a decision based on the merits, a decision, based on clear and convincing evidence. So if this was simply an administrative decision that was being done by some voter registrar in a county, the potential for abuse would be much greater. In this state, in order to be adjudicated or found to be mentally incompetent, it has to be done by a probate judge, and it has to be done in a court of law.
It just makes sense. I mean, segregating people for any reason is more expensive. It's just not costly. It's not even a smart move to me. I mean, we look for integration in our society. We talk about melting pot and diversity and all this. People with disabilities are just another piece of the diversity group. I mean, we do things differently. And I say that because I am a person with a disability. We do things differently, but we still do them. I do everything you do. I don't drive a car or fly a plane. A few things I don't do. But, there's a few things you don't do.
Today, there are more laws protecting a citizen's right to vote than at any other point in U.S. history, largely due to federal statutes protecting the voting rights of groups once considered unworthy. This holds the ideal that a broader spectrum of the population should take part in the political process.
We're talking about social changes. Social changes take generations to be effective. 50 years from now, 60 years from now, I don't think we'd be having this interview. It'll be something else, but it won't be about mentally or physically challenged people in voting or participating in community life.
In the 2004 presidential election, the percentage of qualified voters actually showing up at the polls was the greatest it had been in 3 decades. But having the right to vote doesn't necessarily guarantee that people will vote. That's still left up to you. I'm Damon Mahard. Based on the U.S. Constitution, what are the criteria for having the right to vote? In order to vote, a person must be at least 18 years old and a U.S. citizen. A person cannot vote if they are currently serving time for a felony conviction or ruled to be mentally incompetent in a court of law. What has been used historically to deny people the right to vote? People have been denied the right to vote at different times in our history for a variety of reasons. Among them, race, sex, level of literacy, because they may not have owned property, they weren't old enough, they were not U.S. citizens, they were deemed mentally incompetent, or because they were felons. What types of accommodations are needed to make voting accessible to all citizens? What supports are needed in order to be an informed voter? As a disability group, what role might you play in voter education? What can be done to make sure people's voting rights aren't taken advantage of? What supports are available to a person with disabilities who wants to vote? For more information on voting, please visit www.aapd-dc.org or www.vote-smart.org.